The strange loneliness of being surrounded, but unfulfilled. You're not alone. Not technically. There are people around you. Messages on your phone, voices in the room, conversations happening, plans being made, laughter filling the air. And yet, something feels distant. You sit at a table with friends smiling at the right moments, nodding when it makes sense. But inside there's a quiet separation. You're present, but you're not fully there. You respond to texts quickly. You show up to gatherings. You maintain your role. Reliable, engaged, socially functional. But when you leave, there's a subtle emptiness that follows you home. Not dramatic loneliness, just a strange sense of being unseen. How can you feel lonely when you're constantly surrounded? That question lingers because nothing looks wrong from the outside. You have connections. You have invitations. You have people who care. So why does it feel hollow? Why does connection sometimes feel like performance? You don't feel isolated. You feel unfulfilled. And that's harder to explain. Isolation makes sense. Unfulfillment in the middle of connection feels confusing. You tell yourself you should feel grateful. Other people wish they had what you have. So you minimize the feeling. You ignore it. You keep participating. But late at night, when the noise fades, there's a quiet thought you don't say out loud. I was surrounded, but I still felt alone. You try to rationalize it. Maybe you're just introverted. Maybe you're socially tired. Maybe you just need more rest. But it's not that simple. Because even after time alone, the feeling doesn't fully go away. It's not about needing more people. It's about needing something deeper. You notice it in subtle ways. You're in the middle of a conversation, and then suddenly, you drift. Someone is speaking, you're listening, you're responding. But internally, you feel slightly outside of it. Like you're participating without fully engaging. You know how to say the right things. You know how to react appropriately. You know how to maintain connection. But maintenance isn't the same as intimacy. You can maintain relationships without feeling known inside them. And that's the strange part. You're not rejected. You're not excluded. You're included, but not fully seen. Or maybe not fully revealed. Because if you're honest, there are parts of you that never enter the room. The doubts, the fears, the quiet dissatisfaction. You filter them out. You soften your edges. You adjust your tone. You keep the deeper questions to yourself. It feels easier that way. Safer. But safety can create distance. And distance repeated enough times starts to feel like loneliness. Not because people aren't around you, but because you aren't fully inside the connection. You might laugh. You might contribute. You might even enjoy yourself. But afterward, there's a subtle fatigue. A heaviness you can't quite explain. As if being present required more energy than you're willing to admit. At some point, you learned how to show up. How to be agreeable. How to be calm. How to be the version of yourself that fits smoothly into a room. You became socially intelligent. You read the tone, you adjusted your energy, you anticipated reactions. That skill made you likable. It made you easy to be around. But somewhere inside that skill, you started editing yourself. Not dramatically, just subtly. You stopped saying certain thoughts out loud. You stopped expressing certain feelings. You stopped asking certain questions. Not because they were wrong, but because they felt too heavy. Too complicated, too vulnerable. You didn't want to shift the mood. You didn't want to make things uncomfortable. So you kept it light. You kept it manageable. You kept it safe. And safe conversations can feel pleasant, but not intimate. You can talk for hours without ever feeling deeply connected. You can share stories without revealing your actual experience. You can laugh without being seen. And when that pattern repeats, loneliness begins to grow quietly. Not because people don't care, but because you've trained yourself not to let them in. You might think you're protecting yourself, protecting your image, protecting your independence, protecting your stability. And in many ways you are. Vulnerability carries risk. If you share something real, someone might misunderstand. If you admit something uncertain, someone might judge. If you expose doubt, someone might see weakness. So you manage your presentation carefully. You show strength, you show competence, you show humor. You don't show confusion, you don't show insecurity, you don't show the parts that feel unfinished. And because of that, people connect with the version of you that is curated, not the version that is complex. That curated version functions well socially. It doesn't cause tension. It doesn't demand depth. But it also doesn't invite intimacy. Intimacy requires risk. It requires saying something that might not land perfectly. It requires revealing something that hasn't been polished. And you've become very good at polishing. You polish your thoughts before speaking them. You polish your emotions before expressing them. You polish your stories before sharing them. By the time they reach other people, they're refined, safe, contained. But containment limits resonance. Resonance happens when something raw is shared. When someone says, "I don't know what I'm doing." When someone admits, "I feel disconnected." When someone confesses, "I'm struggling with something I can't explain." Those moments create closeness because they invite the other person to step into something real. But if you rarely allow yourself to enter those spaces, you stay surrounded, but untouched. You may not even realize how guarded you are. It feels normal. You assume this is just how adult connection works. Light, efficient, convenient. Deep conversations feel rare, and when they happen, they often surprise you. You leave feeling different, lighter, seen, understood. And you wonder, why doesn't it feel like this more often? The answer is uncomfortable. Because depth can't happen if you're always managing perception. If you're constantly scanning for how you're coming across. If you're filtering your reactions before they fully form. You can't be deeply known if you're rarely fully present. And presence requires dropping the performance. That performance may not be obvious. It's subtle. It's the version of you that says, "I'm good" automatically. The version that laughs off discomfort. The version that avoids heavy topics because they might disrupt the atmosphere. You might believe you're being considerate, but sometimes you're being avoidant. Avoidant of discomfort. Avoidant of vulnerability. Avoidant of the possibility that someone might see you more clearly than you expect. And so you stay in the middle, connected, but not fully revealed. Present, but not fully engaged. Surrounded, but emotionally alone. That loneliness is strange because it doesn't match your external reality. You have invitations, you have conversations, you have people around you. But what you don't always have is the feeling of being understood without editing yourself first. You don't crave more noise. You crave depth. Depth of conversation. Depth of emotional exchange. Depth of mutual honesty. But depth can't be forced. It has to be allowed. An allowance requires courage. Courage to let someone see what isn't polished. Courage to admit what you usually minimize. Courage to say, "I don't actually feel okay," without turning it into a joke, without softening it immediately. You might fear that revealing more will create distance, but ironically, it's the constant filtering that creates the distance you already feel. You don't need more people. You need more honesty within the connections you already have. And honesty begins internally, with admitting to yourself that you feel lonely even when you're surrounded. That you feel unseen even when you're included. That you feel unfulfilled even when your social life looks active. Those admissions are not complaints. They're signals. Signals that you're ready for something deeper, not louder, deeper. Because being surrounded is not the same as being known. And being known requires that you show up without the mask, even if your voice shakes a little. There's a quiet tension that builds inside you. On one side, gratitude. You know you're not alone. You know people care. You know you have support. On the other side, emptiness. A subtle sense that something essential is missing. That contrast can feel confusing because loneliness is supposed to belong to isolation, not to crowded rooms, not to full calendars, not to group chats buzzing late into the night. And yet, there it is. You can be in the middle of a conversation and feel a small part of yourself retreating. You can be laughing with others while internally feeling distant. You can be physically surrounded and emotionally untouched. That's the strange part. Nothing looks wrong, which makes it harder to explain why something feels incomplete. You might even judge yourself for it. Why am I like this? I should feel connected. I should appreciate what I have. That word, should, becomes heavy because it silences what you actually feel. Instead of exploring the loneliness, you try to correct it. You tell yourself to be more grateful, more positive, more open. But forced gratitude doesn't create intimacy. It just covers discomfort. The real tension isn't about numbers. It's about depth. You can talk to many people without ever speaking from the center of yourself. You can be active socially without ever revealing what matters most to you. And when that happens repeatedly, loneliness grows quietly beneath the surface. It's not loud. It doesn't demand attention. It just lingers, a faint sense that something essential isn't being touched. Part of the conflict comes from protection. You learned at some point that showing too much can be risky. Maybe you were misunderstood before. Maybe vulnerability was met with silence. Maybe honesty created tension. So you adjusted. You became careful. You shared selectively. You revealed pieces, but never the whole. That adjustment was intelligent. It kept you safe. But safety can also limit connection. If you never let anyone see the parts that feel uncertain, how can they respond to them? If you always present stability, how can someone offer support? If you minimize your own complexity, how can anyone truly understand it? There's a version of you that people interact with: polished, composed, engaging. And then there's the version that sits alone afterward, wondering why something still feels empty. That gap between versions is where the loneliness lives. Not because others are absent, but because parts of you are. You've been present physically. You've been responsive socially, but emotionally, you've been slightly guarded. Guarded doesn't mean distant in an obvious way. It means measured tone, measured stories, measured honesty. You calculate how much to reveal. You scan for reactions. You keep things within safe boundaries. Those boundaries protect you from rejection, but they also protect others from knowing you deeply. Intimacy requires exposure, not dramatic exposure, just real exposure. Saying something true without immediately softening it. Admitting confusion without turning it into humor. Expressing discomfort without apologizing for it. Those moments feel risky because you can't control how they'll land. But without them, connection stays shallow. You might begin to notice a pattern. After social gatherings, you feel drained, not because you dislike people, but because maintaining the version of you that feels acceptable takes energy. Energy to filter, energy to adjust, energy to manage perception. And when you get home, the silence feels louder, because in silence, there's no performance, no one to respond to, no one to adapt for, just you and the awareness that something feels missing. That awareness can be uncomfortable because it suggests that the loneliness isn't about them. It's about how much of yourself you're allowing into the room. That realization can sting, not because you're at fault, but because it reveals your own protection. You've been guarding depth while longing for it at the same time, wanting to be known, but fearing the cost of being seen. That's the inner conflict, the desire for intimacy colliding with the instinct for safety. Both make sense, both are valid, but they pull in opposite directions. Safety keeps you controlled. Intimacy asks you to risk. Safety keeps conversations smooth. Intimacy makes them unpredictable. And unpredictability feels dangerous when you've built your identity around being stable. You may not even consciously decide to hold back. It happens automatically. A thought arises, you edit it. A feeling surfaces, you minimize it. A question forms, you keep it to yourself. Those small edits accumulate, and accumulated edits create distance. Distance within connection. That's why the loneliness feels strange, because it's not about absence, it's about partial presence. You are there, but not fully, and partial presence cannot create full connection. You don't need more people. You need more courage within the relationships you already have. Courage to let your voice tremble slightly. Courage to admit that you don't always have it together. Courage to share something that hasn't been rehearsed. That courage doesn't require a dramatic confession. It can begin quietly. One honest sentence, one deeper question, one moment where you don't deflect. Because the loneliness you feel is not proof that you're unlovable. It's proof that you're craving depth, and depth cannot exist without vulnerability. Being surrounded doesn't guarantee connection. Connection requires contact. Contact requires presence. And presence requires that you lower the guard, even just a little. That's where the strange loneliness begins to shift. Not when more people enter your life, but when you enter the room without hiding the parts that matter most. There's a turning point that doesn't look dramatic. It doesn't happen in a crowded room. It doesn't happen during a deep conversation. It happens quietly. When you admit something to yourself, I don't feel fully known. That admission changes the direction of your attention. Instead of asking, why don't people understand me? You begin asking, where am I holding back? That question isn't accusatory. It's clarifying. Because most of the time, the loneliness you feel isn't about rejection. It's about protection. You've been protecting your image, protecting your stability, protecting your sense of control. And in doing so, you've protected yourself from being deeply seen. It's easier to share stories than to share insecurities. It's easier to discuss plans than to reveal doubt. It's easier to laugh than to pause and say, actually, I've been struggling. That pause feels risky, not because it's dramatic, but because it's real. Real moments can't be rehearsed. They can't be edited. They ask you to step out without knowing exactly how you'll be received. That uncertainty is uncomfortable, so you default to familiarity. You share the polished version, the manageable version, the socially smooth version. and people connect with it. But afterward, you still feel slightly alone, because connection without authenticity doesn't fully land. It feels good in the moment, but it doesn't imprint. The shift begins when you experiment with something small. You don't need to expose everything. You don't need to confess your deepest fears in one breath. You just need to lower the filter slightly. Say what you actually think instead of what sounds safest. Admit when something affected you instead of brushing it off. Ask a deeper question instead of staying on the surface. Those moments create tension, but they also create intimacy. You might notice something surprising. When you reveal a little more, the other person often does too. Depth invites depth. Honesty invites honesty. You've been waiting to feel understood, but understanding often begins when someone takes the first step toward vulnerability. And that step might be yours. It doesn't guarantee perfect connection. Some people won't know how to meet you there. Some conversations will stay light, but others will shift. They'll slow down. They'll feel less performative, less rushed, more real. That's when the loneliness begins to soften. Not because you're surrounded by more people, but because you're showing up more fully. You're not just participating. You're inhabiting the interaction. And inhabiting means risking being seen. Being seen means accepting that not everyone will resonate, but the ones who do will feel different. The connection will feel grounded, less about image, more about reality. You don't need constant intensity. You need authenticity. You don't need to transform your entire social life. You need to stop editing yourself so heavily, because the strange loneliness of being surrounded but unfulfilled isn't solved by noise. It's softened by honesty, and honesty begins quietly, with the decision to let yourself be known just a little more than before. As you begin to lower the guard, something subtle shifts. Not externally at first, internally. You start noticing the moments when you almost filter yourself and choose not to. A thought rises. Normally you would soften it, reframe it, make it more acceptable. This time, you let it stay intact. You say it plainly, not aggressively, not dramatically, just honestly. And your heart beats a little faster, because this is new. You're not performing, you're participating. There's a difference. Performance monitors the room. Participation inhabits it. When you participate, you stop scanning for approval. You stop adjusting your tone to fit what you assume people expect. You remain steady in your own rhythm. At first, this feels exposed. You might worry, did that sound strange? Did I say too much? Did I make things awkward? Those thoughts are natural. They're echoes of the old pattern, the pattern that kept you safe. But safety was costing you something. It was costing you depth. And depth requires discomfort, not chaos, just mild vulnerability. You start experimenting in small ways. When someone asks how you are, you pause. Instead of automatic, I'm good, you respond with something slightly more real. Honestly, I've been a bit overwhelmed. Or, I've been thinking about something lately. That pause changes the atmosphere. It slows the interaction. It invites sincerity. Sometimes the other person responds with curiosity. Sometimes they respond with their own honesty. And in those exchanges, you feel something different, not louder, deeper. The conversation feels less transactional, less efficient, more human. That's what you've been craving. Not more company, more contact. Contact with something unfiltered. You begin to notice that your loneliness wasn't about the absence of people. It was about the absence of authenticity. You were physically surrounded, but emotionally edited. Now you're slightly less edited, and even that small reduction creates more resonance. You might also notice resistance. Part of you still wants to retreat, still wants to stay composed, still wants to maintain the image of being steady and unbothered. That's understandable. For a long time, that image protected you. It made interaction smooth. It kept you from feeling exposed. But smoothness isn't the same as connection, and exposure isn't the same as weakness. You're learning that being seen doesn't require dramatic confessions. It requires presence. Presence without constant self-monitoring. Presence without rehearsing your responses. Presence without preemptively softening your truth. That presence creates a new kind of energy. You leave conversations feeling lighter instead of drained, because you weren't carrying the weight of performance. You weren't splitting yourself into two versions, the public one and the private one. You were just one person, unified. And that unity feels grounding. It reduces the strange loneliness because you're no longer abandoning yourself in order to maintain connection. Before you thought, belonging required adjustment. Now you're discovering that belonging requires alignment. Alignment between what you feel and what you express. Alignment between your internal experience and your external behavior. That alignment doesn't guarantee that everyone will understand you, but it guarantees that you understand yourself, and self-alignment reduces isolation. Even if others don't respond perfectly, you no longer feel divided. That internal division was exhausting. Pretending to be fully fine when you weren't, acting unaffected when you were actually processing something, laughing lightly while carrying heavier thoughts. Those small contradictions created tension inside you, and tension accumulates. Now, when you allow your inner world to enter the room, the tension eases. You're not holding as much back. You're not constantly calculating. You're simply there. That simplicity feels unfamiliar at first, because you're used to performing stability. But as you practice it, it becomes steadier. You realize something important. The loneliness wasn't proof that something was wrong with you. It was feedback. Feedback that you were craving depth. Feedback that surface-level participation was no longer enough. Feedback that your internal world wanted acknowledgement. You don't need to become someone new. You need to allow who you already are to take up more space. And space doesn't mean dominance. It means presence. Presence that doesn't shrink to keep things comfortable. Presence that doesn't disappear after the conversation ends. You begin to feel less like a guest in your own social life, less like someone adapting constantly, more like someone inhabiting their own voice. That inhabiting changes the texture of connection. Interactions feel slower, more intentional, less about filling silence, more about sharing something meaningful. And in those slower moments, the strange loneliness starts to dissolve. Not completely, not instantly, but gradually. Because you're no longer surrounded while hiding. You're surrounded while participating fully. And participation is what transforms presence into connection. You begin to understand something quiet. Loneliness isn't always about distance. Sometimes it's about disconnection from yourself. You were surrounded, but you weren't fully present inside your own voice. You were careful, measured, composed. And that composure kept you acceptable, but not always known. Now something shifts. Not dramatically, just gently. You stop asking, why do I still feel alone? And start asking, am I letting myself be seen? That question softens the blame. It replaces confusion with awareness. You don't need louder rooms. You don't need more invitations. You don't need a larger circle. You need alignment. Alignment between what you feel and what you allow to surface. When you speak honestly, even a little, the room changes. Not because people transform instantly, but because you do. You're no longer splitting yourself into public and private versions. You're not leaving parts of yourself at the door. And that wholeness feels different, calmer, grounded, real. Being surrounded no longer feels hollow when you're actually present inside it. Connection stops feeling like maintenance. It starts feeling mutual. You don't have to reveal everything. You don't have to force depth in every conversation. But you can choose once in a while to stay, to say the honest sentence, to let silence breathe. To allow someone to see the version of you that isn't polished. That's where fulfillment begins. Not in the number of people around you, but in the depth of truth you're willing to bring into the room. You were never truly alone. You were just waiting to stop hiding in the middle of connection.